So welcome everyone to this evening's LGFA Coach Education webinar. My name is William Harmon, National Ladies Football Development Officer with a remit for coach education. I'm joined by my colleague Joe Turley from Performa Sports. I'll let Joe introduce himself in a few minutes. He'll give you a bit more detail on what he's about. So we're starting, guys. Look, the webinar is about 70 minutes. Probably won't go over that. Please, guys, use the Q&A function if you have any questions or queries or thoughts throughout the presentation. If your chat function is working, great, but if it's not, just use the Q&A. So tonight's webinar is lessons learned from our coach education analysis. So I hope you're going to enjoy the presentation tonight. So it's basically I'd like you to reflect on what's being presented, and hopefully you can take a few nuggets of information from it that will help you with your coaching behavior and your approach going forward. Just to let you know, all our coach education webinars are recorded. We upload them onto our LGFA YouTube channel tomorrow. So all the webinars that we've done from our coach education webinar series are all available on our LGFA YouTube channel, and just go under the playlist coach education. So all the webinars we did last year and this year are all there for you to view. And also this one that we're doing tonight will be up there to view over the coming days. So without further ado, I'm going to pass you over to my colleague, Joe Turley. And as I said, guys, any questions or queries throughout, just use the Q&A, and I'll be happy enough to present any questions to Joe as we go along. Okay, Joe, over to you.
Thanks, Will. Hello, everyone. Thanks, Will, for the opportunity to share some of the work we've been doing with the LGFA over the last couple of seasons on this area, which is coaching behavioral analysis. So as we run through, it's really just a sharing of findings, things that we've learned. We're still learning ourselves, which is good to do in any practice. And some of the lessons maybe we can take forward, and maybe a couple of takeaways that you might want to bring into your own situations, regardless of maybe the team or level you're with. So maybe to explain a little bit about the project and how we got involved, or maybe I should explain a bit about my background first. As Will mentioned, I'm with a company called Performa Sports. We're based in Harmon here, founded in Gaelic Games maybe about 15 years ago now, so we're getting old a bit. But we've always been learning. Back in 2012, we were lucky to get involved in a very exciting research project, specifically looking at coaches and their behaviours and the potential impact for learning and engagement with the players or athletes they work with. That was done at the time with Loughborough University, who, if you remember back in 2012, London hosted the Olympics. So for that one time and that one place, they had a huge remit of sport and coaches. So we got to observe coaching in action at lots of levels and lots of different disciplines. And from that, we're able to look at maybe models to analyze how coaches behave in practice, whether that be competitive situation or maybe a training and sessions like that. So that's really how it developed for us. And as I said, we're still learning ourselves through that process. So what we're going to cover tonight will be what is coaching behavioral analysis, and then to share some of the insights that we've run through so far with the LGFA. So project overview will be the background of the project, lessons learned so far. It's still an ongoing process, and also really who it's for, which are the players. So we did introduce an option for players to share their voice or opinion, and really importantly, how they felt as well. That's a really important benchmark for us as well, because there are emotional drivers in this process of coaching too, and then some takeaways to take with you hopefully afterwards. I've mentioned our background briefly, but really what came from the research that Loughborough conducted initially back in 2012, they covered a lot of areas, but there were two stark numbers, and they're both the same number, but they relate to two different categories. So, and the number was 80%. When they conducted this research, looking at coaching behaviors, what they found on average, 80% of coaches had no real self-awareness of how they behaved in practice. But then we flip it to the athletes and the players that they worked with. Around 80% of those athletes were acutely aware of, but also affected by the behaviors displayed by the coaches. So that meant that on accident or without awareness, you could actually possibly hinder or prevent learning. So players are going away remembering how they felt about the session or how they thought they were treated, rather than maybe the information the coach is actually hoping or intending to put across. And remember, there's lots of elements the coach need to consider. So just focus in on how we behave. And because it's a really important one, because you can actually block the learning or put a player off and maybe not realize until it's too late. But that ability to reflect, which is what Will said at the start, it's a really powerful thing to be able to do, to practice, to get into the process of because it'll help yourself, but ultimately it'll help the players and athletes you're working with as well. So we'd learned the value from that. What it looks like in practice can be really simple or a bit more complex, depending on if you want to do it yourself, which is a good practice to try it out and see how it works and model it. It's your training environment. It's a brilliant place to learn from. There's huge value in training environments, which often go untapped or unrecorded. So even if you recorded some of a session on your phone or someone had a camera set up, it can be static. But to look back and see, well, where was I in that session? How did I position things? Could they see the visual? Did I continue to talk? Did that distract from the visual? These are all maybe performance habits and behaviors we display, but we don't know we do it. And it can take away from the objective we're trying to achieve. So through the process of research that we built on through academic backgrounds, we try to make it a bit more applied. The advantage of the academic research was that it gave us a structure. So we can see here that we follow a structure based on a template. So we go to watch a coach, it's a coaching observation, but it's very systematic because it has to be, because there are emotive elements into it, but unless we form a structure, we can't measure and we can't compare. So that's just how we form our work and our reports. What we look for in a coaching situation would be what we call primary and secondary behaviors. These would be things, actions and events. And if you think about some of the words I'm going to mention, can you identify yourself using these? So for example, do you instruct? Are you silent? Do you question? Do you respond to questions? Do you model positively or negatively? So what I mean by that is, do you show how something should be performed, like a skill, maybe a fist pass, or how you feel the ball or lift the ball? Or do you show the mistakes as a picture back to things you're seeing happen in performance? So these are all events of how we conduct and behave and show things in training situations or in coaching situations. Then when you look at a game or a training session, we've broken it up into what we call states or practice states. And these can be quite varied. So it could be obviously, and a simple one might be the warm-up, and the end one might be the cool down. And you have everything else in between, from small-sided games to conditioned games to maybe a full match, a small-sided game, or fitness elements. These will differ obviously depending maybe the time of the season you're in and maybe the group you're with and what needs they have at that time. We also importantly look at the recipient, who receives the information. In this case, in the main, it's going to be players. It could also be other coaches, could be volunteers who are working with you. You could be the coach, director, or the games development officer. So you're helping other coaches come through in their formative development as well. And then the timing. So do you prepare your feedback or look for opportunities or cues to interact or intervene? So is that done before, currently, so during whatever the activity is, or do you wait until after, or do you pick your times? And also we look at content. So you can see we look at a lot of detail within this. Content very simply structured. Is it a technical point, maybe a tactical point, because there are two things you're trying to teach, but it could be other elements. And I personally try to look for those softer elements because the value in relationships and understanding the person first is huge, but we need to be aware that that is worth something, so we record that as well. And then the two fundamental environments that you would probably find yourselves in will be the training session versus the match. All coaches wrestle with this, and ultimately all coaches wrestle with process versus the result. How do you get that balance and what are you trying to achieve? So we tailor our templates accordingly, because at a match, it's different. It's management more so than coaching. You're not really the coach anymore. You're the leader. You form things. You have to contend with lots of situations. There's a match official. There's another team suddenly. Not everything is predictable. So you've lots of things to consider. And the training session is different. You're the coach. You're the teacher. So a mistake will not cost you the result if it's a game or a competitive environment. It's a brilliant point to learn from and maybe develop, and you can let them maybe solve things themselves. So your behaviors are affected by the environment, but also maybe by the levels of the need and the needs of the athletes and players you're with also as well. So we cover a lot of points, a lot of details. So there is a lot of numbers, and I've tried to go through this to bring out maybe top level numbers. Otherwise we could be here for a week, to be honest, going through all this information. I know Will loves talking about this, but he might let me go that long. I'm not sure his laptop would last the distance, but just to explain, we were very fortunate to have access to two separate cohorts of coaches. And I'm going to thank them, if they ever watch this back, I'm going to thank them right up front, because They were brilliant to work with, extremely brave, because with this comes a level of vulnerability. And this is not possible unless we're working with good people. And for me, coaches are good people. And I'd even call them superheroes. And I'll get on to that at the end, because they're kids that they work with. They do think their coaches are superheroes. I was even chatting to a coach today. He's a day job in finance, but all he thinks about is the team he works with, the team selection, everything else. So underneath the suit is his superhero outfit, which has got his GA crest on it. So they have this other persona. So the cohorts that we got to work with initially in 2019-20 were 5 coaches, 4 underage, 1 adult. So we got a good spread. That's a good starting point. And we were able to conduct 17 observations, 3 games, 14 matches, just the way some of the underage teams had set up. We missed opportunities to cover some games, but it was a good basis to start from. Probably not enough comparable data to say something was normal or something was different, but we had a start. Then COVID hit, and again, we worked around that as best we could. So we sort of overlapped 2 seasons in 21, 2022. It extended to an extra coach, but again, we got 1 adult situation, and then the other ones were all youth or juvenile situations. And then we got a higher number of games. So we moved up to 6 games out of the 22 coaching observations. And we talk about reflection, but actually on reflection of that initial part of the project, we felt it was important to introduce a voice or an avenue for the players, so that we brought in a player aspect as well, really looking for, we used tactical questions to find out how they felt, because that's the main driver on their perspective, how they felt, because we want them to come back, we want them to have fun, we want to know they're learning and that they're safe and they're enjoying it. So we had a brilliant response across the 6 teams with 86 anonymous player responses back, which is a really good high return. And I'm going to maybe touch on some of the high points and the highlights we got from that at the end as well. So quite a comprehensive project.
Joe, before we move on there, I suppose is, and this is probably the first learning that I observed from this process was, at the start, the coaches were very nervous about this, being observed or someone observing or giving them feedback. But actually, as the process moved on, they found the real benefit of it, that, it's important to get feedback on my coaching so I can improve. And I suppose that's a process. I know a lot of coaches here, would be kind of a bit vulnerable going, geez, is there someone coming to look at me and observe me? Geez, I don't know about that. But it's important really, Joe, into it, that we probably go down that self-reflection, but even getting feedback from others on how we coach. I thought that journey was very interesting to observe, I felt, Joe, before we move on there.
Yeah, it spoke volumes for the people who are involved, and actually credit to the association for the process that they put around it, because yes, there's vulnerability, and and when you look at this type of aspect of sport, which is analysis, it tends to be focused on the athlete or player focused. That's where the camera looks. But in this case, we're actually focused on the educator, the actual coach themselves, teaching the performers. So I thought what worked really well in that context was we're all in it together. And what the LGFA had done was actually set up a peer group. So these coaches were actually bouncing ideas off each other. And we did a couple of sessions with them, and everything was put up, so they're all looking at each other and looking at themselves. But what was really good is they were looking for and talking about the strengths that they saw in others and wish that they had themselves. And in some cases, some coaches felt and maybe learned strengths they never knew they had, but they were aspirational for some of the other coaches. They wish they could behave like that, or wish they could act like that, or wish they could have that response from the players we're with. But and they helped each other along. Some were really experienced, some were just relatively new to coaching as well. So it was all levels helping each other. And I think what really brought them together, Will, and broke down any sort of personal fear, was that they knew it would help them individually get better, but ultimately the end goal was to help the players and the athletes that they're working with as well. That was the bigger picture. And they all spoke very fondly of it as well. Like, obviously, with us turning up at a training session or a match, you're slightly worried at the start that you don't want to be intrusive. So we were very careful about maybe not interrupting certain games or times of the year, things like that. So we were very complimentary around the needs of the coach. But honestly, once you got the first session done, once you record and listen back, their behaviors became much more natural. They completely forgot we were there. And by session 2, 3, the players, we were just part of the team. They'd welcome you in, they'd chat to you, the barriers had dropped, even listening to the conversation with athletes as well as the coaches. So it is something you just have to go through. the natural thing will be fear because it's you looking at yourself. But the great thing is you learn and then you can develop from there as well. So yeah, that's a really good point. So some of the key findings we found based on behavior, but also maybe the amount of time we spend within the states of the session or how we structure them. There was a real dominance in instruction. So really coach-led, the coach is pushing everything. That's a hard thing for a coach to sustain, always pushing. And this was across the age levels. Yes, it makes sense to, when at a start to introduce that it is coach-led because you have the picture and the knowledge, but at some point you have to pull and you're getting something back, and that balance. So the voice or the share voice can be used in different ways potentially. We'll talk about that. But the main 5 that we found initially was instruction, praise, questioning, positive modeling, so showing good technique or action, and then hustle. But you can see there's a huge gap between the lower values and the top ones. So instruction was 56%, really dominated the space in terms of opportunities for engagement and communication. Fundamentally, it is about communication, but the irony is part of good communication also includes silence. And it was way down the pecking order, so because you have to hear something come back, but you have to build their capacity to give you that conversation back as well.
On that one, Joe, everybody listening here tonight, silence. It's very uncomfortable, and I suppose, it is an uncomfortable thing, is silence, you know what I mean? No one's talking, Will. No one's going to give feedback, but I suppose it's just something that we have to probably work a bit more on. I'm sure you'll talk about it later on, but I know a lot of people are here going, geez, the silence is tough because, you know what I mean? Someone wants to break that silence because of the information going back, but I suppose it goes back to, if we keep telling, then we never improve that element whereby there's two-way feedback. So I suppose it's trying, develop that kind of being comfortable with silence, I suppose, Joe. It's not easy.
No, it's absolutely not easy. And it's something you just have to do. The first time you do it, you'll think an hour has passed, but in reality, you've counted to 10 in your head. And they may say something, and if they get stuck, you could ask another question or steer them a little bit more. But the first time you get that response back, it's a massive thing, not just for you, but also for the person that you're with, that player, that young player or adult, whoever you're working with, to know that they can do it and you can encourage that response back. The thing about silence as well is that, if you ever watch back, or if you could see yourself sometimes, you ask a question straight away, you're nodding the head, the answer, you want it, and then you just say it, but that's sort of defeats the purpose of actually prompting the question in the first place. So, it might even be one of the takeaways, I know Will had mentioned it before, is like, ask a question, count to 10, and then if you need to, do another question or steer, but allow them that opportunity, because they need to think about something as well. And what they come back with, and maybe how they process it, will maybe tell you how much they really understand or don't. And that can help in the teaching of them themselves. I suppose the other thing we found generally was there was a large portion holistically that was non-active, so 24% of the time that the coaches had their players was no action, so there was no session element running. It would have been stop, start, or gaps between. So that can build and build and build. So that's eating into your contact time, which is a massive thing to consider. So if there's going to be inactivity, can we plan when the activity is going to be, how long the activity is going to last for, or if you're going to allow an activity, what can we put into that for learning or bonding or communication? So can players talk to players? Can you prompt questions? At least allow them to reflect on maybe the mini tasks they've done and then prepare for the next one. So try and fill it in.
Joe, so that you're sending me for, no, one question came in, you can go back to this about what is hustle. Someone asked me what is hustle. Binny asked me, you might just clarify that. But just on this one, so you're saying for a quarter of a session, this is the 2019-22 cohort, obviously, 24%, there's nothing happening. So for a quarter of the session, there's no learning, nothing going on. Like that's a high percentage, Joe.
That's huge, yeah. So if you think of contact time as a barrier, just think of that challenge. And if you have 1 hour per session with your players and you're losing maybe close to 20 minutes or whatever it is, depending on the session, and you add that up over a month, over a season, you're missing out on weeks, if not months, of potential contact time. So inactivity will happen if you allow it to. It'll manifest itself if you allow it to. So you certainly need to look at your session overall and say, well, where are my natural breakpoints, but can you do things in the breakpoints that allow things to happen? I know when we worked with Loughborough University, Dr. Chris Cushion, who led the initial research into analysis, looking at coaching, was his sessions, he would always have a stopwatch in his hand, because one of the things he noticed was the amount of time he lost. So he would have a timer to reduce. So just by focusing on time and water breaks and everything goes in between, he was able to reduce his non-active time by 75%. So he was getting days back, if you think about it, of learning, of teaching little things, but actually little things that were not happening before. And those little things can mount up into big things.
I think that the timing. So everybody listening here, the timing. I do that in my own sessions, Joe, joint time. So, okay, guys, have a drink of water. But while you're over there, think about the game we're playing. And I'm going to ask you, how can we improve it? So that's what you're kind of saying, is that they're still actively engaged in the session, even though they might be getting a drink of water, right? In groups of 3 or 4, go way over there now for 30 seconds, have a chat about the game we're playing. And on the way back, we'll have a chat about, okay, how can we improve it? So that's basically saying, that's they're not active, but they are active in terms of learning. So it's how do we make that inactivity a learning moment, really, Joe, into it? And that comes down to planning and what questions you're going to ask and getting them involved in the decision-making process. So that's a very interesting learning point. Hustle, Joe, what does hustle mean before we move on to you can move on.
Hustle, to translate, maybe is more of an American used phrase, but it means you work hard, put the effort in. It's that type of expression. So it would be used for maybe shouting a command on during a game, or maybe there's a stamina run or that type of thing where you say, keep going, dig deep. So hustle, more of an American type term, not to swindle anyone, but it's more to reinforce your hard work or effort. But so that's what that means. So that would have been that initial cohort, Will, that we went through. And then when we looked at the most recent one, which we've just wrapped up last season, you can see instruction is still massive. 60% is actually increased. Now, bear in mind, we did have more games covered, more coaches, so it made sense. Probably it was proportionate, it went up. But because it's quite similar, it means that behavioral trends, that's reassuring for us in terms of analysis, that the trends are quite consistent. So the right types of behaviors for us to investigate and build. So instruction, praise, and questioning, you can see, are following through like the previous cohort, and they're the main values, but instruction still is way beyond the proportion of the other options. Interestingly, what has come in now is humor. Now, humor was not in the previous one, but humor is massively important as well, not to be undermined, because we're talking about relationships as well. So a bit of fun, bit of humor, it can just help relax people. You yourself, the coach, assistant coaches, people are helping you. Also the players themselves, having a smile on the face is a good thing to have. It's a good place to be to help learning and enjoyment at whatever level, whether you're adult or juvenile structures. So humor's element good there as well. I think that came through partly because of the personalities of some of the coaches in that particular cohort, but also the familiarity they had with the players that they were with. So you can see when you go into an environment, the difference between a coach who's new to a team or a club versus a coach who's into year 2 or 3, or even a coach who's come back and has inherited a group that he or she had taught further down the line, so you can see that those relationships, those bonds follow through. And in many cases, it's a reason that players come back. So personality elements and humor, things like that, really important, not to be undervalued as well.
I think
now,
that's very interesting. I think that's very interesting, because like the top 3 reasons that we had from LGFA research previously was players in ladies football want to get involved because they want to enjoy themselves, have fun, they're with their friends, but also improve and develop. And I'm looking at this stat, and I'm a coach. If I'm sitting down listening to this, wherever you are, guys in Ireland, I'm thinking, hold on a second. If they want to improve and develop, then we need to involve them. Then, geez, the questioning and our, involving players and creating a real positive environment. I suppose that instruction percentage has to go down, and the questioning has to come up. Don't it, Joe? If we really want to involve them in and help him, give him proper feedback, analyzing, observing. Really, Joe, those they have to change really in terms of those percentages. So everybody, think about it tonight. Maybe in your next session, whenever it may be, get someone even to observe you and just ask them, will you watch my session tonight and see how much I talk? And if you're talking too much, then obviously that's less time learning. So Joe, I suppose it's really, can we turn those percentages around in the coming years? That's really what we're trying to achieve. before we go into the states of time. That's what we're ultimately trying to, I suppose, go after, Joe, really.
Yeah, well, for us, that's what we've identified, and that's something that we really need to support. And it's not something that you can dramatically just turn overnight, because we have to consider the culture we're in, the challenges that coaches face outside of the remit of coaching is everything else, and the pressures are under as well. So they try to juggle quite a lot, and they try to, I suppose, again, with contact time being a limiting factor, is it's almost as if they try to get as much out as they can in the time that they have. But that sometimes could be like throwing mud at the wall. Some will stick, some will slide off, some will overload. So you have to sort of question, again, if you can look back and reflect and look at change, even little things might actually achieve more success longer term, because the basis is stronger, and then you can build from there. And even if it starts to creak a little bit, you can go back to where you were and then build again, or spend a bit more time on an aspect and broaden it out. And fundamentally, communication is often two-way. So by reducing instruction or command-led approaches, you're inviting a space, an opportunity for the voice to come back, those you're working with.
And I'm just learning here, Joe. I'm learning here going, okay, well, if we only have 1 hour session with our underage, and if we're an adult group, you're with 2, 3, geez, you have to really, make it worthwhile and quality. So therefore, less is more, even in the message you're trying to get across in terms of what you're doing. And I look at the states of time here, Joe. It's very interesting. Small-sided games, technical practice is so low in terms of the percentage of the session. But the non-active and probably playing a general game is very high. That's very interesting, Joe. For people listening tonight, what are we learning from that?
Well, see, the thing too is probably if we go through the elements, the reason the game jumped up was because we did more games. So the duration of the game is sort of conditioned because it's an environment. It's going to be pre-game, your warm-up, your instructions, team selection, things like that. Then you're into first half, then you have your break, second half, and then you have a bit of a roundup. So the game is more than just when the referee blows a whistle and ends the game. It's a little bit around it and in between. So that time, you're active as a coach or a manager doing different things at different times, or as we found, you repeat the same things all the time. So it just depends. So that's why that number is that high. But non-active would have been the biggest, but you can see it's still pretty consistent in terms of how the sessions are maybe overall viewed or planned out. And then the warm-up has stepped up a bit more because there was more warm-ups happening in the game. So again, that helped that as well. Plus each of the sessions we did, they had maybe more so than the previous court, they had a real proper structure for warm-ups. And some of the coaches actually had another coach there specifically doing the warm-up portion, and helping with the cool down. And then technical practice and small-sided games are really important parts of teaching the games. But again, some had it specifically as part of the session, but it was consistently a tiny part of the session. So it had quite a detailed warm-up, a proper cool down, little bits of skill sets in between. And then the smallest bit was actually a conditioned version of the game you wanted to go and play, which doesn't maybe make sense because the game is what you want them to play. And then it's trying to get more contact time or more play time in situations where you're setting this up. And you could even complement it with the non-active, a way of possibly reducing the non-active and integrating conditioned games or small-sided games might be, as Will mentioned, throw a question into the group about the condition situation you're setting up. So maybe it's there's a sweeper in play, so an extra defender than an attacker, and you're playing half the pitch, and you've actually set a task for the attackers, and they're getting a drink of water. So that's in their non-active state, but you've actually given them a challenge. And then you've asked the defenders, I'm going to speak to you afterwards about how you read this setup and what you did, who made the calls to combat whatever the attack we're trying to achieve. So you've asked 2 separate questions, broken them into 2 separate groups. Then they're in action, which is a small-sided game. And then you can go back to them with, well, what did you think? So an element of theory.
Joe, do we have to really, I suppose, Joe, we have to really value small-sided games is high. Like in my own sessions, small-sided games is a high proportion what we do. 5 aside, 7 aside, 8 aside, 9 aside, whatever. So small-sided games, I just think we need to value those games more because they do help us, I suppose, with certain aspects of our gameplay. So I just think, we need to value that. And also, I suppose girls like, female players like working in groups, they engage a lot more in groups. So therefore, hence why small-sided games is even more beneficial from a female aspect. Just something to consider really for people when planning sessions.
but also it allows the coach to see how it works. So that's another visual back. So that's another way for the coach to, to ascertain learning. Has it happened? Can they see it? If you're playing a conditioned game and there might be, say, 2 touch and then a kick pass, are they able to do that? Or can they take the kick pass straight away if it's on? So how can they read and adapt in the situation unless they can show it back to you, particularly if you're not allowing the opportunity for a conversation to come back? So it's definitely what we would be looking for over time is the hope that we could reduce the dominance of instruction, so direction, but also to see a more even spread of some of the actions. But probably what would be interesting would be, could we see an increase in play related sessions? So those conditions, skills, small sided games, things like that, and then correlate that with the players to see how they felt about things they'd learned in the game through that process. So they're actually being kinesthetic learning, they're actually doing it, getting the balls in the hand, hearing, listen to what's happening, but then there's a break from you talking, so they're actually doing it and thinking about it at the same time as well. So as I mentioned, the pretty consistent variables that we found in terms of behaviors were instruction, praise, questioning. The slight differences between the two were really down to the amount of coaches and the amount of the fact we had more games, because instruction is particularly pronounced in a game, in those in-play situations as well. And it probably relates also to why questioning reduced a bit more, because there was more coming from the coach side than there was being invited back. And then praise was increased as well, because again, you tend to see praise used more in game situations or where there's game type scenarios in a training session as well. So I've a jumble of text on the screen, but you can read through this if you wish as you go through, but I'll try and paraphrase it as we go along. 60% is a big value. It's well over for half the percentage time we have in a session. And that's what came through in terms of instruction. So it's the dominant behavior. It had increased on the previous term really because of the games, because in games specifically, there's a huge amount of instruction and communication, even when they're trying to play the game. So I know the GA, the LGFA and the associations have ran initiatives like the silent touchline, just to let the players play. But that maybe is something coaches need to look at themselves as well, because sometimes the most vocal are the coaches of the team that they're with, but the players are still trying to contend with the game and play the game. So you can see in the initial cohort, pre-match instruction was around 70%. In game, it increased to 83%. So your players are spread across the field of play. The players closest to you are those that are sitting on the bench at the time, but the instruction is still coming through. And then it actually drops during halftime, so 63%, even though it is a time for contact and it's obviously it's a narrow or limited period. And then the following cohort that we had, it reduced to 65% pre-game, 81%, and then 81% halftime. So again, the numbers are very high. And below, I've tried to explain the 65% the following year, because what was interesting, of all the coaches we looked at, one coach in particular did not instruct at the game that she was at. But the context for her game was, it was a challenge game at the start of the season. She was new to that team. So she took a very sensible approach. And isn't me speaking for her, I hope she doesn't mind. She wanted to see what she was working with. Does that make sense? So she was observing her team. So her main behaviors were really questioning and hustle. So again, just to explain hustle, she wanted to see hard work and good effort put in that game, because she was making judgments as to, are they comfortable in the ball? Do they know the space and the positions to hold in the field of play? Who's the main players? Who's brave? Who gets, whatever it may be? What's the goalkeeper like? Do we need to try a different player? Who could play in different positions? So she was new to that particular team, an underage team, and just wanted to see what she had to work with. And then she would move into planning sessions afterwards. So that maybe explains why that reduced. But other than that, the other coaches were familiar with their teams, but again, it was very dominated by coach-led instruction.
So Joe, again, I'm listening to this. I'm learning great stuff here. So is it kind of describe the coach? Is that the coach up and down the sideline instructing, go here, go there, do this, do that, don't do this, do that. So it was very verbal. Were these coaches up and down the sideline constantly talking? And then the coach who did stand back and observe, obviously she did in the challenge match, whereby maybe the outcome wasn't as I suppose impactful. So therefore she allowed herself to stand back and observe. So are we seeing a lot of coaches up and down the sideline talking, chatting? Are you that coach out there? Often I'm going, am I that coach? Constantly instructing. Is that what you're kind of saying? Is that it's constantly instructing while the game is going on?
Yeah, I mean, I've been at games where one team, it's where they have an extra cornerback, and then suddenly they have an adult midfielder, and then there's an adult gone into corner forward. So they've actually gone past the line. They've put themselves into the game, and they've gone right in. I've seen one go right into cornerback, stand beside the cornerback, and say, look, start to explain things to her, and then showing her how to tackle or whatever it may be, and then maybe where to go, even though the ball's coming at her. So that's where they've maybe taken a step too much. They've actually put themselves into the performance. I know from having a young daughter playing football and being at the games, it is very difficult, to be quiet and silent. But because I'm self-aware now, because I've gone through process like this, just that has helped me. I remain quiet. I'll only help if she needs something, but I'll stand back. But by being silent, I hear a lot. And the amount of stuff that's shouted on to the players, and then my daughter plays in goals, so she's doing a kick out. When you listen, it's like being in a packed stadium, even though she's down in the local club. It's like being at Crow Park. The amount of voices that she hears shouting at her, say, kick here, kick to that person, go over here, or whatever it may be. And I'm thinking, if I put myself in that situation, how would I cope? I would be completely overloaded. And sometimes she gets upset because she's not exactly sure where to put the ball, but it's because of that frantic noise, that mess that causes confusion and doubt. And that's not what we want. We want to actually build confidence. And that's where the training sessions really help, so she can cope with situations like that and then play past it, because she knows maybe where she's targeting for the kick out, and actually the players will present for her, so that's the other thing. A good pass isn't the person who kicks the ball, it's the other people that make the pass and give choice and options. So it's how they work together.
But also, if you're more silent, you're going to do a lot of hustle, keep it going, well done, the good score. But I suppose if we want to be more observant, if we want to give quality feedback, we want to improve our players, in particular at halftime, if you want to give 2 or 3 really relevant points to try and improve performance, then if we're involved too much, then maybe we might miss 1 or 2 of those things. Whereby if we stand back and be more observant, you're allowing yourself to process what's going on, and therefore will allow you to give more to the point information at halftime. I think that's probably important too, Joe, before you move on, that sort of stuff,
Yeah, I suppose what you've described there, Will, is that if you as a coach, if you put yourself in the scene, you can no longer see the scene because you're in it, if that makes sense. Whereas if you take 2 steps back, not only do you see the scene, you see either side of the scene, so you can see the symptom of maybe where an issue is coming from. If you need to make changes, if it's a game, tactical, or whatever it may be, or to give praise back to players that are doing things that maybe others are missed, haven't seen. So that's what we're trying to. So how you approach a game or a match situation will impact how you plan to behave. But in terms of even the language that you use as well, plan the language. That's something that can be planned in sessions and games as well. So you can actually say less with more, and also allows you to do repetition, which is an important part of coaching. No matter what pressure you're under as a coach to change things all the time, you actually need to repeat things so it goes in and players can actually remember things and take it on as well. So just on the point of match versus training session, so we looked at some of the data just to pull out a couple of key points, really to see, well, would there be marked differences based on the influence of the environment, the place you're in. You're up against an opponent versus, these are players playing within their own club and environment. And we did find that it's actually the match, when you go to play the game, the instruction level jumps massively in comparison to the training session. So it's up to 82% as an average versus 55% in the training session. So you can sort of see the difference there in terms of, a lot of coach-led at competitive or competition type situations versus still a high number, quite a high number, well over half of your voice time or coach time, where you're actually still talking and still leading everything else. And silence is minuscule in comparison, like 1% at a training session, 6% at a game. Whereas that's a really important thing. Granted, it is an uncomfortable element, so for example, I keep talking. I know I can't hear you back, but it'd be very uncomfortable for me, other than Will jumping in the odd time to ask me a question. So I know there's engagement. So if I was with you in person, I could see the faces and reactions, and I would try and break it up a bit more. But, that sort of shows you the difference. Now, questioning can fill in some of the space, but also can be a good measure of getting reassurance that learning has happened or what understanding is. And you can see again, it's been used more at training than it is a game. But again, it could be used at the game because more so probably in the game because the decision makers are the players. They're on the pitch. They have to make the decisions. They can't rely on you for every single play. I know we sort of were being a little bit funny about the coach who goes on the cornerback, things like that, which does happen. But you have to allow them to make mistakes, part of the learning process as well, so they learn from it. So if it is something you can address, it's a reason to identify and do something about it. And in praise, you can see there's an increase in praise as well. But again, at training, so that's, that'll be well done, good play. Maybe they've done something positive in the skills or maybe in the small-sided game. And then we talked about maybe humor as well as an important bit. Now, humor has actually come back more into the match than in the training session, which is interesting because humor in those situations would be maybe at the start, a little something lighthearted because the game could be nervous for the players potentially. So that's good. That's a good thing. And maybe at the end of the game, particularly if you win the game, and in most cases, the coaches won the game. So they were happier than maybe the opposition. So there's a bit of humor there. Plus, they tend to talk to more adults at the game because there's going to be parents, other coaches, people there. And that's why that sort of maybe more adult type interaction led to a bit more humor, but more laid back. And it tended to happen either at the very start or at the very end of the game. So there are elements to look for as you run through. And then what the key findings, so actually this, what Will had described is maybe a coach situation like this, so that 82% of instruction in play. So just let that sink in. So your players, like in this picture, are spread across the field from corner forward to corner back and everyone in between. You're on the other side of the field and you keep running in onto the pitch and you're still talking and telling them what to do. So that doesn't really help the players long term, and maybe isn't good for your own heart or well-being either. But the problem too is it narrows your view of the performance massively because, as we said, you're putting yourself in a position in the scene, and the scene in this case is the game of the performance. So it's very hard for you to look back accurately and reflect on it. Your memory will be, if you're lucky, around about 30% of recall of what happened in that performance, and it will arguably be things that annoyed you more so than anything else, or you'll concentrate on those, but you miss all the fine details of things that you helped make possible. How they picked the ball up, how they passed, even someone who didn't touch the ball, how they covered in or backed up another player, how they presented for a kick out. It didn't go to them, but they did the right move. So you do need to stand back a little bit more, and you will see a lot more if you do that. So it's just about positioning and awareness. And again, that idea to reflect and look back at things as well. So imagine you were the player, if you put yourself back in those shoes and all you heard was this. The problem also is with that volume and that frequency of information, unfortunately, it becomes noise. Now, what you could have said would have been brilliant, but because it's so common, it becomes like wallpaper. Like we have done through projects like this, we've worked with some professional teams in the UK. And what we always used to find was the goalkeeping coach was the worst for this, because the goalkeeping coach would kick the ball at a goalkeeper and always say, good save, good right hand, good left hand, up high like this here. And they never stopped. They talked and talked and talked. And then if they said something really important, if you asked the player afterwards, the player never heard it because he was just used to the noise. It was just part of the process. And so things of value get lost in this noise or this volume of conversation that unfortunately is all one way and there's nothing invited back. So it doesn't really encourage others to come back into it. And I suppose the question or challenge we all face in coaching is, who is it for and how does it help them? And that's where that rebalance or that readdress of instruction to maybe a little bit of silence to a question or two with silence, to get something back. No matter how simple, it's the start of something coming back to you. It's the start of the process of transitioning from entire push to that pull of getting something back from the playing group as well. So we mentioned praise and questioning, if you remember, as the two secondary most consistent behaviors between each of the cohorts. So they retained their positions quite high in the standing, and there was a slight reduction in the questioning for the second group. And humor came in as a new addition. And again, I mentioned just personalities, I think were part of that, but also more so the lineage or the knowledge they had of the players from having coached them before. And there was that sort of, you definitely felt that very warm welcome and environment when we went to those situations. And then the non-active state we've mentioned already, whilst it didn't decrease slightly, it was because of the game situations which forced action because it's in the context of a game. But we talked about it earlier, roughly you're losing somewhere between 18 and 22 minutes per session relative to the time of your session. So your session might be 50 minutes, 45 minutes. It might be an hour, slightly over an hour. A game day will be longer because you've traveled, you're there's things that happen. But I mean, if you did a calculation on that of the time that you have with your players, it's almost a sin when you think of how many times or opportunities you lose out on. And so we try, as I mentioned, inaction will be part of any group or social situation. It's really trying to minimize it and plan it. And it might be the case that if you want to test this yourself, use a stopwatch or use your phone and have a timer on it. But to do that, maybe you'd need someone to watch you, because if you're in the session, you can't do it. So get them to watch you first. And then it might be just, I'm going to look at time and look at efficiency. If it's too high or you surprise yourself, plan an action to how I can address that. And can I reduce it a little bit? Can I steal back 5 minutes if I do something else in a different way? Could I steal back 50% of this time if I give them a little bit of homework before they turn up at the training session? Would that mitigate the time we have for Q&A at the start, or do I get lots of questions? Or maybe I get fewer questions, but they're more consistent. So therefore I prepared them in advance, and then we can go into the session and work our way through, and I can test it as we work our way through, and then bring the stopwatch with you. So click and stop when you say, okay, right, blow the whistle, we're going to move on to the next transition. You've got 60 seconds to transition or whatever it is. You set targets for the players as well. So once they get into the frequency and speed of a session, then you'll allow them the rest times. But again, use the rest time not to be doing nothing, but actually to engage, do Q&A, do something, get them to give you something back as well.
And Joe, just let everybody know, lads, if you want to go into that planning a session in more detail, we have an actual specific webinar on that topic and how to, plan sessions and stuff like that on the LGFA YouTube channel. Go back and look at it, and it goes through a lot of things, techniques Joe is talking about in terms of timing. Okay, when you're not active, how do you make that a learning moment and things like that. And I suppose, guys and ladies and gents and everybody out there, if you see your players standing and looking at you with their hands crossed, you're in trouble. So just minimize that. Let's get players more active and involved. So sorry, Joe, you can move it on there.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Thanks, Will. And then the other thing was, now we didn't have a large volume of comparison for adult versus underage. It was dominated obviously by underage coaches that we had through this, but we, just as an exercise, we wanted to see, well, were there any sort of key fundamental shifts in that a coach who's with an adult group versus a coach who's with an underage? And it's very consistent. So you can see there's very little variance in the number. The trends are still the same in terms of the dominance of instruction versus silence versus response to questions. Again, hustle has come in because we mentioned that before, that that reward to work hard and put the effort in as well. So what was reassuring for us is that regardless of age group, it's still on the coaching side, and that the behaviors that we have focused on are consistent. So it'd be interesting to see how we could maybe intervene in that in some way, and then see could that change over time and reflect that. So you'd love to see this model change, and actually over time you'd love to see the model change in that there should be a difference between adult and youth, because then you're looking at needs versus delivery, but also the behavior of that coaching delivery as well. So then to continue on the findings here, we found that when questioning occurs, it's most likely to happen during the cool down or non-active stage. So that makes sense because there's not other things happening. But again, you can load questions in at different times in the session. It counts for about 17% of the pre-game phase. But interestingly, there's no questions asked at halftime in any of the games. So again, who has to make the decisions when they're in the game? It's the players. How do you prompt a recall to something they've learned before, or to reassure them that they can address something? It's often with a prompt, which is a question, because you're trying to avoid giving them the answer because they have the answer, but you need them to regroup, refresh, and realize, oh yeah, I know how to do that. And then you let them back in because they have to apply the action. As I mentioned, praise is most likely to be applied as maybe reassurance, but also encouragement. So when it's used most when we have our small-sided games, conditioned games, and skill practice, albeit possibly what the research is telling us is those elements should happen more, and then praise would probably increase if more of that would happen, but also as encouragement during physical effort. So obviously when the hard work has been done, tired legs, fatigue is in, it's the voice of the coach is more of a reassurance, a driver in that case as well. But also that's where you can encourage teammates to be drivers as well and help other players on also. Coach response to questions still accounts for about 4%. It's in the non-active state because that's when questioning can happen or tends to be happening, whether that's planned or not. We didn't define that, but that's where we noticed it happen between the two cohorts. And a change in the most recent cohort is that more questioning happens during the cool down. So you could see that there was a deliberate attempt by coaches once the session had completed to ask the playing group to think about things or have one or two specific questions. Or one example, we went and we were lucky enough to attend a training session maybe in the build up to a championship game. So there was specific questions asked of the players to think about and prepare because the championship game was the following weekend. And then we followed them through to the game so we could see the link between the two. So that was a good example where they timed the questioning at the right time and they'd actually conditioned some of the session of how they were going to play in the next game. So that was a really positive example. You would maybe like to see the percentage of those terms again grow a little bit more as part of the learning process and the communication process.
And even there, everyone who's listening in, guys, you could very simply at the end of a session, okay, girls, jogging trees over to the sideline, have a discussion on what you take from tonight. So when you come back then, they're giving you feedback. Now that they take on board what you try to get across. And also just my own behavior in terms of coaching. If we lose a game or win a game, I never hold the players back and ask them questions after a game. I'd say, listen, think about your performance. We'll talk about it Wednesday night or Tuesday night. So I actually don't do any questioning after a game because I want them to think about the performance and listen, we'll address it on Tuesday night. Because sometimes, Joe, you could be there all night after a game, in particular if you lose a game, you just want to get home and whatever. So I think this timing of your questioning when you do it, it's very important, and how you go about it. It's just something to think about as coaches. Sorry, Joe.
Yeah, well, what Will has said there will come with experience as well. You know yourself that if you lose a game, everyone wants to get off the field. So there's a time. It's not saying that there's a rigid structure you have to follow. The truth is there is no secret ingredient to being the perfect coach or coaching the perfect way. The thing is, it's still about good people understanding the needs of other people they're trying to help, and it's whatever that means to you in your situation. So it'll be all those flavors and it'll be different timings, but also as your players' competencies grow and their maturity grows, there's more that you can get them to do for themselves. That's what we're really trying to get to the basis of. I just have a very short video example to let you see basically what this looks like. A coach being filmed or audio being recorded, and also how humor can be really useful to interject to maybe build a bit of relationship, break down barriers, and maybe plant certain thoughts. So I'll cut it off shortly, but I'll just let it play through. So she'll say a few words, she'll pause, then she'll say a few more words, and then she'll follow through.
Did you ever do Irish dancing? I didn't think so.
So the coaches use something that players are familiar with, in this case Irish dance, and other players did. And
666. Okay, 75%, please. I call it 75, right? So it's just 75. Back in the line anyway for the crack door.
You can see how now this particular coach is a very organized coach, a very precise coach, a very detailed coach, and for her to introduce humor shows her human side, which is brilliant, but also it allowed her to get a bit of a laugh, a bit of response from the players as well. And she's using it in warm-up portions. And while she's saying things that are funny, she's still getting the response that she wants. She's getting adherence to, okay, we're on the line, but it's said in a funny way. So it's not in an abrasive way at all. The fact she mentioned, did you ever do Irish dancing because you wanted the players to hold themselves correctly in their core position, which is something you do in that other skill. And then the players then have a visual to refer back to in terms of, okay, I'm going to look at myself as well and try and make sure I'm straight and correct. But it makes it a bit of a funny element as well. So you can still get communication, teaching, instruction, and there is a response. The response is laughter, it's humor from the players. So that's enjoyment. And remember, that's something we want to achieve as well. We want players to enjoy it and want them to come back. So in terms of the players, one thing we did do was open up an opportunity for the voice of the players to come through. And the process behind this, we'd been involved in projects before where there's a feed for the playing group to come in anonymously to maybe back up things we're working on or details that we find in on the coaching side as well. And how we did this was an anonymous research survey with permission of the clubs and the coaches, and it was optional. Players could do this or not, or it was passed through guardians in some cases, or parents. And the response was massive. Like, it was overwhelming. The players wanted to be part of this. They actually knew we were turning up. Some of them would wave at us when we turned up and set up the cameras and things like that. So they knew we were there, part of a coach education process. And we asked a couple of questions really to get emotion or comparable information. So we have this belief, or really coaches are like superheroes. That's how we treat them. And we asked this question, and people might say, well, why do you ask this question? But remember the groups you're with and the time we're in, they need to hang their hat on something that they can identify with. So really the superhero is the idea of a brand. Brands are built with lots of values. So they're advertising TV, movies, merchandise, whatever it is, but the values is what has been pushed across. And we wanted to follow that theme through. So we asked the players, like, if your coach was a superhero, who would they be? And these were the three main respondents. So 28% of the players identified their coach as Superman or Superwoman. And it wasn't gender specific. These are all female coaches and all female athletes. And it was great to see that they're not bound by gender boundaries. You know, if it's Spider-Man, it's a superhero, it doesn't matter. But at the time when we did this project, if you remember, there was a Spider-Man movie out, so Spider-Man was everywhere. So I was assuming that would be an influencer of that type of character. But the reason it was that we were looking for the reason they were picking these brand associations. That's really what we were looking for. And it was because the coaches had superhuman values. And you can see under the Superwoman, Superman option, it's selflessness, loyalty, kind-hearted. They're a protector. The players felt safe with them. They trusted them. The Wonder Woman one was, she was wise. There was something they could learn from them. She was courageous. You know, she'd turn up in all conditions against lots of challenges. She would get us on the pitch. She would get us time on the pitch. Strength. She was a team player. She'd be with us. They felt like they were part of the team. The Spider-Man one was determination. They would not be put away or put down. They're making sure there was a place for the girls to play. And agility, kindness, and intelligence. So again, these are massively positive attributes, but they're all what players think of coaches. So huge power, and as Spider-Man said, with huge power comes great responsibility. But that's the mantle a lot of coaches carry in the situations they go into. But it's massively reassuring for coaches to know they're making a difference and that they mean so much to the players. Okay, you may not win the championship, so what? It may rain all the time, so what? You know, you have a group of players that you're helping achieve something. And then we also look for word association. So this sort of backed up the feeling that we got from the players, so encouraging and approachable. You know, there was obviously words like they felt some of the coaches sometimes were stern, but in a good way, because they knew it was for their own good. Someone even wrote brutal, but in a positive way. So that might be extreme honesty, but again, resourceful, honest, passionate about what they did, positive. So these are from teenage girls right up to adults, you know, seeing this in these role models, these coaches helping them. So these are really good values that are following through as well. Some of the questions that we picked out, and we did ask a range of questions. We sort of had techniques for trying to get opinions back, but just to pick out some of the main ones was, one was, overall, how would you rate the feedback your coach gives you? So bear in mind the research we've just talked about and some of the points that are coming from the player perspective. So 48% excellent makes perfect sense to me. Now that's really reassuring, but the problem is there's more, over half aren't at that level, all right? So that's the challenge. So for example, if we were in a couple of years' time, maybe 2 or 3 year seasons time, coming back, asking these same questions, if instruction was reduced to 45 or 35%, if silence increased to 10, if questioning, responsive questioning had maybe doubled, would that 48%, would that jump to 60%? You can sort of see how we can tip a little to get a different response longer term. When do you feel your coach is most likely to give you feedback? And the dominant one was when something goes wrong. And that is to be expected because there's a brilliant inherent value in all coaches that teachers have, you want to fix, right? So if you speak to teachers, be like with teachers, I know my mother-in-law's a teacher, so I know them well. It's they want to fix. It gives them a sense of achievement because it's the good thing. It's the right thing to do. The problem with it is, in coaching and teaching, is that you tend to be drawn and always look for the things that are wrong because it allows you to satisfy that need, that good. It's an inherent good, but we need to look for the other things as well. So the good as well as the incorrect, so that's the balance. What type of feedback works best for you? So 40% said it worked for them when the coach explained it to them. So instruction is fine in that case. Showed them, so positive modeling, so physically shows them. Now, showing them could be you doing it, or it could be you're picking out 3 players who do it, but allow everyone to see it. The important bit there is if you do the visual with players demonstrating, remember to stop talking and let them focus on looking at the visual. I've seen this a lot of times where the coach will walk around the grid and continue to talk. But remember, particularly if you talk all the time, they're looking to you to try and pick up what is the instruction. So they look at you, the visuals over here, and then you let them out into the session and it doesn't work. It's because none of them really saw the visual because they were still following you as you walk around. So the show and your position is important for that. And then let them try it, let them make mistakes, and then ask them what they think. So that could be a non-active element used as a coaching point to think about what they've just done, consider, and then back in. Or what would they change? How likely are you to ask a question if you're unsure about an aspect of training? Just under half said very likely. Okay, so that's a positive, right? I actually thought it might have been less than that. So that is a positive. But again, we've got half of our group that we don't know if they'll ask, and they're not 100% that they can ask, so that's something we need to work on. But again, that would be benefited by readdressing how we lead the process of coaching. So a little less instruction and allow a voice for them and maybe encourage them. There will always be people who sit at the back and they might be quiet, but they could have brilliant ideas, but it's about working out how you tease that out of them and how you maybe get the peer group to help them as well. What do you enjoy most? The backup Will's point to the LGFA's research is, 45% said having fun. And the other next big one was learning a new skill. So those were the things that really followed through. So even for this group, which was diverse from 14-year-olds right up to senior adults, it was the same characteristics following through. So there's lots of consistencies in what we're doing. And then also there's consistencies in terms of how we behave as coaches in coaching processes is possibly affecting how players feel they can interact or what they possibly are limited by, purely by how they perceive it. Because the problem is how they perceive it is the truth for them, whether it's true or not. So that's how we need to maybe readdress how we deliver and maybe get a bit more back from them.
Just before you go into the final slide there tonight, Joe, the most likely players, in particular teenage girls, when we're working with our Gated for Teens initiative, is that they're more likely to ask a question in small groups. So go back to that small-sided games, working in small groups, very important. Throw out the question and let them ask questions about them, amongst themselves, and maybe explore and find those answers in smaller groups. Because girls might ask a question in front of the big group, but they're more likely to ask their peers in a smaller group. So those smaller groups are very important. And also fun can be challenging. As you said here, like, did you enjoy yourself? Yes, but fun can also be challenging, can it, Joe? It can be working really hard for each other, so there's just small little techniques as coaches we need to probably just, I suppose, develop it more in terms of engaging our players.
Yeah, and I suppose just on that point, the last stat I wanted to show with you was this one, because it's the most important stat we probably captured, and it was 100% of the players enjoyed their coaches' training sessions and would go back to training. So that's ultimately what we want to achieve, so we want them to learn, but we want to learn in a safe and fun environment. And ultimately, longer term, we want them to be part of that learning. So it's because it is very hard for you to push all the time. So one of the takeaways I've mentioned is actually that point, but just as a couple of highlights, maybe I know we've mentioned some of the points that have gone through. Hopefully some of it you can maybe see in yourself, or at least maybe think about what reflection could be for you. The big thing I've learned through my own process is reflection is something you can learn, you can practice. It doesn't come naturally to everyone straight away, but there are ways and techniques that you can try to start simply and build it up. It's important because we don't remember or have a really good view of how we perform or how we behave in coaching. And for all the coach education courses in the world, the one thing they can't teach you and you will not learn is how to behave. That's something you need to figure out because it's a personal thing or a personal challenge in many respects. And it will blend or suit the group you're with or not. And that's something you need to be aware of and address. So you may need to alter to suit maybe different environments or different types of needs. It's important because the players you're with will be affected by your behavior more than you realize, to the point where they may not come back, or they may be sad, or they may not learn anything, because it's an emotional thing. And emotional drivers are the big thing here, and we need to be aware of. And it's purely a coincidence or a consequence, not by intent or misdeed, but it can happen. But if we can be aware of how we behave, we can control it, because coaching behavior is a controllable. We just need to look at it ourselves first and then address any things that we think we need to, but also talk to others. The idea of doing this in isolation is a difficult thing to do. It's often where you need to start or have to start, but actually having friends, having peer group, having someone you can trust and talk to get another viewpoint, another set of eyes can really help. That can over time lead to greater sense of self-awareness, knowledge and understanding. And I think a very general thing that we've noticed is often, well, nearly in all cases, more experienced coaches will display more silence, but the messaging that they put out will be massively valued, because they pick the times to talk and they pick the phrases to use and maybe who they give it to. And they know that's the triggers. So they don't dilute their message. Their message is super sensitive because they're pockets of gold, as opposed to they're shard everywhere. Silence is a golden opportunity to listen and learn. Also the test learning from those you coach, because it creates a vacuum, and they'll either step into it or they won't, or you can tease them into it or draw them into it in different ways. So this could be a very simple one to try at a training session, is ask a question, obviously related to something you're physically doing with them or explaining to them, and see can they answer back. Could be one-to-one or one to a small group, as Will had mentioned. And whether you cross your fingers or stamp the ground, count to 10 to force yourself not to give the answer straight away, or be prepared to ask another question if you want to steer it on a bit more, give them a bit more of a direction. Be aware of your non-active periods, as we mentioned earlier. Turn them into active learning or learning zones, and use your stopwatch if you want to make the overall session more efficient. Plan your stoppages around activity intensity, so obviously you're managing the condition of the players as well, but use all the touch points that you can to your advantage. Coach-led environment is very difficult to sustain long term. Player development is a journey. Players will forget where they came from, coaches don't. But in order to help them through that journey, at some point they have to be able to go themselves. So you need to start that transition at some point, where you can pull some stuff from them. That's them offering ideas, suggestions, and challenges back to you, the coach. So they're looking for help as opposed to being told what to do. So if we can reduce the level of instruction, what could we fill that time with? Just think of the time you could get back, and how much more efficient or how much more effective could the coaching process become in your own environment or with the group you're with, or maybe how the players understand learning over time. So I think that's the main points.
Thank you very much.
I know we've covered quite a lot there.
Yeah, in the Q&A, I'd love to know, what did you take from tonight? Just for ourselves, just in the Q&A, what do you take from tonight? And also, you're going to get a survey after this presentation. Please, guys, fill it in. We're always trying to improve and develop in terms of what we do. So, guys, we have a few more webinars coming up. Go onto our LGFA website and please, look at the various topics that are coming up. Please feel free to log on to those over the coming weeks and months. But tonight we're looking at coaching behavior, coaching analysis, and what has the coach education analysis from LGFA, in particular Performa Sports, has assisted us in terms of, I suppose, our coaching behavior and our approach. And it's really influencing what we're doing from a coach education perspective. And tonight I found very interesting. There's a lot of challenges there as coaches as well. But please, guys, even to try this out, if you don't have the cameras and stuff, maybe in your next session, get someone to observe your session. Just watch me there. Watch one or two things and just learn, and always looking to improve and develop. But Joe, I really enjoyed tonight. So in the Q&A, please tell us, what did you take from tonight? What was your one takeaway that you're going to try to bring into your coaching over the coming weeks and months? But Joe, I just want to say thank you very much for that really informative webinar. I think, that information is really, really powerful, and will really, if coaches, take it on board and self-reflect on it, there's some really nice nuggets information there that will hopefully help with their coach in behavior and approach. But I leave it with you, Joe. Give me one thing. If there's one thing you'd say to coaches or a bit of advice, what would it be?
It comes down to reflection.
Yeah.
That's one thing, just to reflect. What you will see in it, it could be very simple, or could be, but that one simple thing could be fundamental, and you don't realize how the magnitude of a simple change in you could have to multiples, which are the players you're working with. And that would be the thing. Just be open to reflection, to look back. It's not a critique. It is a brave thing to do, but it's a good thing to do. You will feel better in yourself. You'll be more confident, more reassured in terms of knowing what you're doing is correct and knowing what you're doing is working. And I suppose the last thing I would say is that just again, genuine thanks to the coaches who've allowed us the opportunity to visit their coaching sessions. Without those coaches, and indeed the players and the clubs and their permission, none of this would have been possible. And as I said, yes, it comes with vulnerability. They're all very brave, but if you spoke to any of those coaches now, they're very comfortable in themselves and what they do. They're all going places, and they're very, very happy to help each other. And there's a real close community now of I can see developing of a coaching peer community or coaching peer group, that female coaches helping other female coaches, which is brilliant, because that confidence has come through, because it does work. It really does.
Okay, so on that note, everyone, I say thank you very much, Joe. So everyone, over the coming weeks and months, I hope tonight was very beneficial to you. So be brave, get out there, just self-reflect on the outings that we highlighted tonight, and see where you fit in to all that. And I would acknowledge everyone is doing great work. Any coach that puts themselves out there to coach a group of people to improve and develop, you're doing a great job. If there's even one small nugget of information tonight that'll help you, I suppose, even do better or improve, then hopefully you enjoy this evening. So on that note, thank you very much, everyone. And on that note, thanks again, Joe, and look forward to future, I suppose, coaching research with LGFA. So thank you again, everyone, for your input tonight, and hopefully we'll see you soon. Thank you.